For my final project, I focused on the life and works of the Queen of England, Catherine Parr, more famously known as the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII. I used Joanna Russ's chapter on responses from how to suppress women's writing and the notion that women cannot be writers because they need to be something else first, a mother or wife in her case, to better understand how Parr was suppressed throughout history. In this speech, I will discuss why I believe Queen Katherine Parr should be included in the literary canon and why her life and work should be studied in academic settings, namely literature, religion, and history courses. As I've mentioned, Catherine Parr was the Queen of England. Parr became the Queen Consort of England in 1543 after marrying Henry VIII, subsequently becoming the mother and mentor to his three surviving and legitimate children, King Edward VI, Queen Mary I, and most notably, Queen Elizabeth I. What is not as well known about Queen Catherine is that she was the, quote, first woman to publish in print a work of her own under her own name in England and in English, as mentioned in the book Catherine Parr, The Complete Works and Correspondence, edited by Janelle Mueller on page 1. As an English major and a history minor, I really love hearing and engaging with stories, both from fictional realms and tales from our own history, as well as getting to study and write on voices whose stories don't often get told. In conjunction with these interests, one of my favorite musicals is Six, which takes a more modern spin on the story of the six wives of Henry VIII. This is where I was first introduced to Queen Katherine Parr. The musical's aim is to tell the story of these queens as their own person, not simply the wife of Henry, diving into their personal interests, stories, and returning their voice back to them as it's been forgotten in his story. Shortly after getting assigned this project, I heard Parr's song, I Don't Need Your Love Again, and found out her lyrics applied to how their voices were suppressed. Because I'm not a singer, I'm just going to read this quote. Remember that I was a writer. I wrote books and psalms and meditations, fought for female education, so all my women could independently study scripture. I even got a woman to paint my picture. Why can't I tell that story? Because in his story, I'm fixed as one of six, and without him, I disappear. We all disappear. And that's sung by Izuka Hoyle in the original West End cast recording. This line really stood out to me and resonated with what Russ discusses in the responses chapter. Her work in writing and education disappears throughout history, and her legacy is reduced to simply being her husband's wife. While doing my research for this project, I came across a blog dedicated to queens throughout history called Teen Queens, in which the historical scholar Gabby Story did a piece on Queen Katherine Parr, a quote from which I felt summed up how Parr was forgotten in history, despite her role in influencing England's religious foundations, the impacts of which we can still see today. Quote, Catherine has since, at times, been relegated to a pale imitation of herself when the Tudor tale is told, and was initially given little credit for the expansion of the new faith. However, evidence points to her as an important influence on the religious convictions of England. Her queenship gave her an opportunity to promote a revolution in faith, and, discreet though she was, she had taken her chance so well that she almost lost her life in the process, end quote. How her religious writings almost ended her life is something I'll discuss later on in the presentation. While strides are being made in both historical research and in pop culture, it's important to note how even the works done by important figures like the Queen of England get suppressed and forgotten throughout time. Not to mention how writers without the resources and platform that Parr had fall victim to this suppression as well. In the responses chapter of How to Suppress Women's Writing, Russ writes, quote, another response is to write, but to agree with the assertion that women's writing must be inferior to men's, or that women are, or ought to be, not writers, but something else first. For example, dutiful wives and mothers, from page 120. This suppression method does admit that women can write and have written, but aims to manipulate the writer into believing she is being a bad mother or wife because she is focusing her attention on her work instead of her family. Not only does this negatively impact the woman herself, but also impacts how the rest of the world views these writers by putting other, more traditionally feminine labels in front of writer. By doing so, her work can be forgotten in history and pushed aside in favor of how she fits into her husband's story. In an article entitled Catherine Parr as a Woman of Letters, written in the Huntington Library Quarterly in August of 1960, C. Fenno Hoffman Jr. writes about the Queen's efforts to save Cambridge University after her husband created an act, quote, for the dissolution of the colleges, chantries, and free chapels at the King's pleasure, for page 360. An academic in her own right, Katherine Parr sought to preserve the school, but only if they changed their structure to align with her wishes. Quote, for Cambridge to deserve saving, its humanist enthusiasm should be curbed or modified. Greek and Latin should be taught as means, not ends in themselves. Educational means must be religious, not moral or literary. Greek philosophy must be subordinated to Christian doctrine. From page 361. As we can see today, Cambridge University withstood Henry's 1545 Act, persevering for another 476 years. But their perseverance as an educational institute is not attributed to the Queen, but to Henry, as, quote, in the same letter, Catherine transfers all credit from the university's preservation from herself to the king's generosity and concern for good learning, also on page 361. In addition to needing to relegate her successes to her husband, Parr's achievements in religious literature caused a strife in the English court, as her reign came shortly after the beginning of the English Reformation, when Henry split England from the Pope and the Roman Church. Her work in religious literature and her intellect caused some of Henry's advisors to accuse her of heresy, according to research done by Judith Arnott for a blog dedicated to English historical authors. The article title being Katherine Parr, the not so boring sixth wife of Henry VIII in 2014. After convincing her husband that she was not a heretic by appealing to his own narcissism, quote, Catherine claimed that she only ever discussed religious matters with her husband so that she may learn and benefit from his superior mind, end quote. Eventually, the king and queen stood together against the advisors who threatened her life and his rule. But the act that saved her life, in turn, suppressed her writing and intellect. Quote, Catherine had won, but only by the skin of her teeth. Thereafter, she kept her opinions to herself, suppressing her views and ceasing her work on her half-written manuscript, The Lamentations of a Sinner, which was not published until after Henry's death in January 1547, end quote. I believe that Parr was affected by the responses method of suppression because prior to doing this research for the project, I only knew of Parr through her marriage and not by her work and academic achievements. By reducing her as such, the milestones she overcame as the first woman to print under her own name in England and in English, as mentioned in Katherine Parr, the complete works and correspondence on page 1, are overshadowed and forgotten to time. Relegating her to just being the sixth wife of Henry VIII erases a huge part of her identity and how she ruled over England. This erasure also targets Henry's other wives, reducing them to simply a number in his roster. By giving attention to the works written by Katherine Parr during and after her reign as queen, we can continue to chip away at the strictly patriarchal literary canon, restoring the voices taken from the women throughout history. With all of this in mind, I think that the works and life of Queen Katherine Parr should be studied and read, namely in academic settings. Due to their highly religious nature and the fact that they were written close to 500 years ago, I doubt that these works can serve an entertainment purpose today. But when considering how Parr influenced the entire Kingdom of England, I do believe that she deserves to be studied in history courses, as Hoffman agrees in the Woman of Letters article. Quote, in assessing her career as a woman of letters, however, it may seem that what she wrote now has historical value at best. But her writings are well worth examining as documents of the time, from page 349. In Judith Arnott's article, she discusses how Catherine's role as a stepmother to the future beloved Queen of England, Elizabeth I, provided the foundation for England's future rulings. Quote, Elizabeth was at Catherine's side in 1544 during her role as regent, and there can be little doubt as to the impacts of the princess's first experiences with the challenges of female leadership. She witnessed firsthand her stepmother's control of a male-dominated world and the strategies the queen undertook to maintain her authority over the council, end quote. And according to William P. Howard in his article, Katherine Parr, The Religious Convictions of a Renaissance Queen, from the Renaissance Quarterly, quote, Katherine Parr's Lamentation of a Sinner merited more attention than it received, and that comment could be justly extended to the Queen's religious convictions in general. These convictions not only reflected an important contemporary element in English religion, but through Catherine's role in the religious formations of both Edward and Elizabeth, they also influenced the distinctive character and temper of the English Church, from page 346. Acknowledging the disparity towards the Queen's works, it's important to note how her religious acts as regent and queen would have been subordinated to her husband, just as her efforts to save Cambridge had been. From my research, I found that many historians attribute the religious affiliations of both Edward and Elizabeth to Catherine, which proves to be useful during her reign. Elizabeth stabilized English religion, returning the country back to Protestantism after her father's dissolution from the church to marry her mother, Anne Boleyn, from the Encyclopedia Britannica. For my research presentation, I discussed the life of Catherine Parr, Queen of England, and discussed how her writing was suppressed using the notion that women cannot be writers because they need to be someone else first, found in Joanna Russ's chapter on responses and how to suppress women's writing, to make my argument. I also discussed why I believe Parr deserves a spot in the literary canon and should be studied as the important figure in English history as she is. The opening line of Six the Musical is divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived, written by Moss and Marlowe in 2018. But Catherine Parr did much more than survive her marriage to Henry. She broke boundaries with her writing and cultivated religious reform in her role as queen and in her role as mother, proving that women can indeed be wives and mothers, but their ability to write and publish books does not deter them from doing so. Thank you.